So you folks are used to this venue out in my garage, but let's move into the house. For a long time I've been talking about creating a sword wall in my study. This video is me doing that. I'm going to try and get 40 swords on the walls of my study. Let's see if I manage it. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So what I'm doing here is standing in front of one of my sword racks, in fact the only sword rack that I have at the moment in my study, in my house. Now, those of you who follow the channel regularly will know that I used to film a lot of videos in my study in my previous house, and I had a lot of swords on the wall and it was a fairly useful backdrop for me to film against. Now I mostly film in my garage. However, I have for a long time been talking about the fact that I'm going to show you what I'm doing with creating a sword wall in my study, which will become a secondary, perhaps even a primary environment for me to film in. Obviously I don't have as much space to move around in my study as I do in the garage, so I will probably film most videos still in the garage and outdoors in my garden and in external environments like castles and stuff like that. But it's nevertheless, especially in wintertime, useful to have somewhere you can film indoors, especially if you're presenting more, shall we say, researchy, academic material with books and such like that doesn't require lots of movement. Also, it's very, very useful because it gives me the ability to have swords on the wall directly behind me, which I can refer to, pull off and show to you. Now, you will notice I have one of those fairly typical looking sword racks that are commonly sold. They're usually made in China and they're sold for things like katanas and essentially martial arts, traditional Asian martial arts weapons. Now, I have resisted going down this route for a long time for a number of reasons. I think the primary reasons being I wanted to do something a bit different. Secondly, a lot of the racks that I'd looked at didn't quite look like they would fit or accommodate the kind of swords that I wanted to put on them. You can see that this one does. Also, I was wedded to the idea of having hooks in the wall, and finally, and not a minor factor by any point, I felt it was a bit, not cultural appropriation, but I felt like it wasn't quite appropriate to the swords that I was intending primarily to put on the rack. So as you can see here, this happens to be a collection of every single one of these is a non-regulation Victorian officer's sword. I think they're all, in fact they are all Wilkinson swords, non-regulation in various different ways. And I do get lots of questions asking to talk more about those types of swords, and obviously I will do because that's the nucleus of my personal collection. But, so I felt that that type of rack maybe wasn't appropriate to this kind of sword, and anyway, various things have changed which have meant that I have gone down this route, okay? And the two main things that have changed are, one, convenience, and I'll come back to that point in a second, and two, the fact that I no longer regard it as cultural appropriation or inappropriate to this type of sword, for a very important reason. I was researching sword racks, and by complete chance I stumbled across this example that you're now looking at, which is copyright incidentally of the Victoria and Albert Museum, and this rack, or part of a rack, half of a rack, is in the Victoria and Albert Museum's storage. I don't think it's on display at the moment. And this is 17th century English. Now, this kind of blew my mind because I had never really thought that we had sword racks like this in 17th century England, but it seems we do. And fundamentally, they are the same mechanically as these types of racks that you see behind me. Yes, aesthetically it's different. It's not lacquered or painted wood. It is some other kind of, it's probably bare wood, and it is heavily carved, this particular example. But when you actually think about it, if we look at gun racks have existed in Europe for hundreds of years, ever since guns have existed pretty much, and are fundamentally the same kind of thing to this kind of sword rack behind me. So in actual fact, probably, given that if you want to hang something on the wall, there's only a certain number of ways you can do it, so probably this type of sword rack has actually existed in Europe for a long time. It's just that there aren't many surviving and they're not very well studied or documented. Right, finally I want to talk about the convenience convenience issue. So formerly I used to use hooks, and they were procured from the night shop, and I can't remember the manufacturer of them, but essentially they are very, very good hooks, and I do recommend them for those of you who want to put a few swords on the wall. However, in my current house there are a few things which have changed compared to my old house. Number one, these internal walls are stud walls. They're hollow, and so putting individual hooks into this type of wall is less convenient than putting a rack on the wall. And the second thing is that I'm trying to create a sword wall, which you will hopefully at the end during this video you will witness the evolution and the creation of. And that sword wall is going to have around 32 swords on it, and including these 8 behind me, that'll be 40 swords, and that will leave some other space in my study for additional swords as well. So my aim was to get 40 plus swords into one room. Now clearly if I was doing that with hooks, that would mean a lot of hooks, so at least 80 hooks, 2 hooks per sword, and therefore 80 holes. 80 holes in the walls is a lot of holes. If I ever want to move things around, that's a lot of fixing up to do. It's just a lot easier to do it with a rack for all of the aforementioned reasons. So which rack did I go for? Well, I've put a link below here. This is a relatively cheap sort of £30 rack from Playwell Martial Arts. I've known them as dealers for years. This is a relatively cheap rack, and this one behind me was bought as an experiment because I didn't know if this would accommodate this type of sword, and I didn't know if it would how it would fix on the wall securely, and I'll show the fittings that I'm using in a moment. But it all went incredibly easily and well, and then I've left it up there a bit like medieval cathedral makers. I didn't trust it until it had been up there for a few days, best part of a week, and it stayed strong. I've used it, I've moved the swords around, I've changed them around, I've been checking the fixtures in the wall because there are only 2 fitting points into the wall, so I was a little bit nervous about putting this weight of swords onto a rack like this with only 2 fixture points, but they are very strong fixture points, and so I now tentatively trust it. I trust the rack not to break, and I trust the fittings to stay in the wall basically, which I was a little bit nervous about. I grew up in houses which all the walls were made of brick inside, very solid, so I've always been a little bit nervous of these types of cavity walls. Stud walls as we call them. Right, so the rack comes from Playwell Martial Arts, the link below. It's, as you can see, it accommodates 8 swords, it does fit sabres, it does fit basket hilts, certainly the 3 basket hilts that I've got, it fits them. It does fit symmetrical hilts like heavy cavalry swords, 1796, 1821, 1864, it does fit those. So it fits the swords, it holds the swords, it seems secure, it's economical, and importantly, I have bought 5 of these racks, and that actually works out cheaper than buying all of the hooks, the 80 hooks that I would have needed, certainly the specialist sword hanging hooks. It works out quite considerably cheaper, about half the price, to buying all of those hooks, because those hooks are quite expensive if you're buying them in a large number. Right, so hopefully what we're going to do now is you are going to see me creating the sword wall. So what you have here is the sword wall. This is going to be the sword wall. As you can see, it is a virgin wall at the moment. It's completely blank. It's got a fair size to it. It's not a big study, but it's certainly enough to hopefully get 32 swords on here. I've of course measured the racks. I know that I can get 4 racks on here. The racks, when they arrive, incidentally come in this type of very compact box. So when you get 4 of them, they don't take up very much space at all. So they're dead easy to construct. They basically slot together, made of 4 components, 4 slats that slot into each other, and then they're held by essentially 4 pegs. So they're easy to take apart if you ever need to, if you need to move house and transport them or anything like that. And importantly, they're held by only 2 points into the wall. So therefore, if you're in a property where you don't want to be doing lots of drilling into the walls, you can get away with only doing 2 holes. If you can surreptitiously get away with doing 2 holes, then you can still get one of these racks with 8 swords on it. Just so you know, so you've got the full picture of things, so I use these metal self-drive fixings with screws included. What they are a kind of fitting that goes directly into the wall. You don't need to drill a hole, but obviously you need to mark a hole. And you will need a spirit level and perhaps some type of steel rule or other straight line. And so a little pro tip here, well, it's a pro tip, I'm certainly not a DIY pro, but I noticed, so initially I went to put the holes so that they were completely level this way, but the little hooks on the rack itself aren't necessarily 100% equal on each side. So what I have found is more reliable is to measure the vertical rather than the horizontal. This does unfortunately sometimes lead to the fact that the fittings in the walls might not be at exactly the same level, but the important thing is that your rack is hanging level. So, you know, these are not expensive racks, and the hooks therefore are not necessarily always going to be to the millimetre exactly at the same height as each other. But the important thing, as I say, is that you have the rack hanging perfectly vertically, so that you don't have swords kind of like trying to slide off. So there you go, there's the little, let's get it to focus on that. That's the thing that drives into the wall, that goes into the plaster. You screw it from the back with a Phillips screwdriver. So you screw that into the wall, it goes in itself, just applying some pressure to it. And then once you've put that into the wall, you get the screws that fit into it. So that's now very secure in the wall, and they are really, really strong. And these just screw into the back of there, and you screw them in, and then these are very, very strong. And that reliably seems to take the weight of 8 swords and their scabbards. And bear in mind that these European swords with steel scabbards are of course heavier than things like katanas with wooden scabbards are. Hey folks, so I've put together these 4 racks from Playwell Martial Arts, link below, and a little bit of feedback on the constructional quality of them. So they seem to be kind of MDF, they're very, very strong, they don't seem to split or crack very easily at all. They're put together with pegs. They don't really require any additional tools, but I would recommend a rubber mallet or a shoe or something else you can hit the back of those pegs with. They are wedges. And interestingly, so I've made 5 of these now. One of them went together incredibly easily and almost is a little bit, has got a bit of movement left in it. The other 4, when put together, are completely rigid and square. One of them, the wedges were quite difficult to get in, and despite hitting them with a rubber mallet, I couldn't get them all the way in, so they were projecting at the back, and I had to therefore go into the workshop and saw off the back of the wedge so that it would sit flush against the wall. The final 2 did go together perfectly well, just whack with a rubber mallet, and they went in far enough. These are softwood wedges, so they went in far enough into the holes that they're not going to be a problem at the back. But yeah, they seem to be good, strong things. The hooks, I'll just give you a little look at those quickly. You can see that they're secured. They're not massive beefy things, but they seem to be strong enough to do the job. Secured by 2 screws into the back of the MDF vertical, and I was a little bit concerned about the strength of these originally, but as I say, I've had my other rack on the wall with 8 swords on it and scabbards, and it's held out perfectly well. So let's get measuring up and fit these 4 racks on the wall. So I've done it. Each of the racks took about 5 minutes to put together, more or less. And then the wall took about an hour to do. Just, you know, taking it relatively slow. I wasn't super rushing, but I wasn't taking it super slow either. Just making sure everything was square, everything was balanced. Obviously fairly important because with this type of hollow wall, if you screw into it and you put it in the wrong place, it's quite a hassle to fix up again, and you can't very easily put a hole, you know, a millimetre to the right because you've just blasted away a hole through that plasterboard. So you have to get everything straight. It's better to measure 3 times and cut once, or screw once. And I think everything's straight now. It's obviously fairly important if you're going to have stuff on the wall, hopefully for years to come. So you guys are going to see this behind me for a long time to come. So I want it to be all square and straight. All that remains now is to put some swords on the wall. It's going to be a more or less random selection for now. But this is probably the bit that you're most interested in seeing. So let's go and dig out 32 swords and stick them on the wall. So there we go, folks. This is the building of a sword wall, and you'll notice it's probably a bit echoey in here, but this will certainly help a bit with that, as will other things I'm putting into my study. So there you go. You saw the creation of my sword wall, and this will hopefully be behind me for many years to come. I've just put a lot of my nicer swords out on collection here. I've now got 40 in the room if you exclude the ones tucked away in corners and stuff. So I've got the rack that you saw at the beginning, which has got 8 on it, 32 behind me, that's 40. So I've got 40 on the wall as it stands, which is a good day's work as far as I'm concerned. I'm happy with that. I hope this has been perhaps useful for you, maybe an inspiration for things you want to do in your house with your weapon collections, whether it's swords or firearms or whatever else, bayonets. As I mentioned, I've just kind of thrown out some of my better swords onto the collection here. I'm sure this sword wall will change. The thinking behind it at the moment is that I've tried to have a representative. I've got some medieval swords, I've got some Napoleonic swords, and I've got some Victorian swords. Obviously, I can't put things like the massive Zweihander or indeed the rapier out here because they're just too long, but you get to see those in my other space anyway. And you do see other weapons, you know, the Dane axe and the spears and all that kind of stuff in the garage space. So this is more kind of the wall display sized things, although I do have some muskets and rifles and bayonets in the corner there. So hopefully this will be a useful secondary filming space for me. I hope that has been interesting to some degree, and I hope that you'll be seeing this, and probably things will move around and change from time to time, but you'll be seeing this for many years to come. Thanks for watching. Cheers, folks. Give us a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you again for another video on Schola Gladiatoria channel. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.